A man walks into Australia's highest office and lasts just 40 days. Not because he was lazy, not because he was weak, but because the country was a minefield. His own side was split down the middle, and the clock was already ticking the moment he sat down. Arthur Fadden's story isn't the usual tale of a born ruler. It's the story of a boy who learned to count coins before he learned to dream, and who would one day try to count his way through a national crisis with enemies on every side and allies who could vanish overnight. He was born on 13th of April 1894 in Ingham, a small Queensland town where heat and hard work shaped people early. His father, a police sergeant, brought a sense of order into a world that didn't offer much security. The family moved, as police families did, and young Arthur grew up watching how quickly circumstances could change. One posting, one decision, and your whole life was somewhere else. That lesson, life can shift without warning, never left him. School came, but not the long, comfortable kind. Money was tight. The future wasn't a wide-open road. It was a narrow track with bills on both sides. Arthur left school young and went to work. He became a clerk, then found his way into accountancy. Numbers, ledgers, the cold honesty of arithmetic. In a country where fortunes rose and fell with droughts, floods, and commodity prices, being able to read a balance sheet was like being able to read the weather. It didn't stop the storm, but it told you when it was coming. He trained as an accountant in an era when the profession was still carving out its authority. There was no glamour in it. No applause, just long hours, careful columns, and the constant pressure of getting it right. Because if you didn't, someone lost money they couldn't afford to lose. That pressure forged him. Cautious, methodical, allergic to waste, and intensely aware that promises mean nothing if the figures don't add up. Then the world cracked open. The First World War arrived like a thunderclap across the empire. Australia sent men overseas. Communities watched their young disappear into uniforms and ships. Fadden tried to enlist, but his eyesight failed him. It was a quiet rejection, the kind that doesn't make headlines but leaves a mark. While others went to the trenches, he stayed behind, working, watching casualty lists, feeling the weight of being useful in a different way. It sharpened something in him, a belief that service wasn't only about heroics. Sometimes it was about keeping the machinery running when everyone else was gone. In 1919, he married Ilma Thornberg. It wasn't a political marriage, not a strategic alliance, just a partnership built in the real world, where stability mattered. They would have children, and the responsibilities of family life would anchor him. He wasn't a man who could afford to chase fantasies. Every decision had a cost, and he felt those costs in the most ordinary, relentless way. Rent, groceries, school fees, the future. By the early 1920s, he was in Townsville, building his career and reputation. Townsville was a working port city, a place where prosperity could be loud one year and vanish the next. It was also a place where politics wasn't abstract. Politics was wages. Politics was shipping. Politics was whether a business survived the season. Fadden began to step into public life through local government, serving on the Townsville City Council. It was the kind of politics that didn't come with grand speeches. It came with arguments over rates, roads, sanitation, budgets, unromantic problems that still decided whether people lived decently. And here the first real conflict of his life took shape. Arthur Fadden versus the chaos of economics. Not as a theory, but as a force that could crush families. He watched how quickly a downturn could turn proud workers into desperate men. He watched businesses fold, not because they were foolish, but because the world shifted. He learned that the public wanted certainty, but the economy didn't care what anyone wanted. Then came the Great Depression, and it hit like a slow-motion disaster. It didn't explode, it suffocated. Jobs disappeared, credit tightened. The optimism of the 1920s drained away, leaving fear in its place. For an accountant, the Depression wasn't just a headline. It was a daily parade of ruined ledgers and broken plans. People who had been careful still went under. People who had done everything right still lost everything. If you want a visual image of that era, picture a man in a small office, staring at a set of books that no longer make sense because the world has stopped paying its debts. That was the atmosphere Fadden breathed. It was in this pressure cooker that he moved from local politics into the state arena. In 1932, he entered the Queensland Parliament, winning the seat of Kennedy. Kennedy was vast, remote, and tough, an electorate that demanded stamina and practicality. It wasn't a place for airy rhetoric. It was a place where distance itself was an enemy, where communities could feel forgotten, where the economy was tied to industries that lived and died by global prices. Fadden's style fit, careful, numbers-driven, focused on what could actually be done. He joined the Country Party, the political home for rural interests, farmers, and regional communities. But even that label doesn't capture the reality. The Country Party wasn't just about farms. It was about the constant fear that the cities would make decisions and the regions would pay the price. Fadden became a voice for those who felt the system was tilted against them. And he did it not with theatrical anger, but with the steady insistence of a man who could point to the figures and say, "Look, this is what's happening." In Queensland politics, he rose quickly. He became a minister in the state government, taking on portfolios that demanded competence rather than charisma. He served as treasurer of Queensland, and that role suited him like a tailored coat. Budgets were his battlefield. Revenue, expenditure, debt. These weren't abstractions to him. They were levers that could lift people or crush them. During the Depression's aftermath, every decision was a trade-off, and every trade-off created enemies. Cut spending, and you're heartless. Raise taxes, and you're a thief. Borrow, and you're reckless. Do nothing, and you're useless. Fadden learned to live inside that no-win logic. But Queensland politics was also a cage. The state was dominated by labor for long stretches, and the non-labor forces were often fragmented. Fadden could be brilliant in the ledger room and still find himself blocked by the arithmetic of seats. He was ambitious, yes, but more than that, he was restless. He could see that the real decisions shaping Australia were being made in Canberra, especially as the world began to darken again in the late 1930s. Because while Australia was still recovering from one catastrophe, another was forming beyond the horizon. Europe was rearming. Dictators were swallowing countries. The idea of another global war stopped being unthinkable and started being inevitable. For a man like Fadden, who had already watched one war take a generation and a depression take the rest, the approach of a second war wasn't just frightening, it was infuriating. How could the world be so careless with human lives and national finances again? In 1935, he made the leap to federal politics, winning the seat of Darling Downs in the Australian House of Representatives. It was a decisive move, from state budgets to national survival. Darling Downs was agricultural heartland, and his voters expected him to fight for them in a parliament that could easily be dominated by urban priorities. He arrived in Canberra not as a celebrity, but as a specialist, an accountant stepping into a room full of lawyers, unionists, and career politicians. The federal non-labor side was itself a complicated machine. The United Australia Party, led by Joseph Lyons, held government, and the Country Party was its coalition partner. Coalition politics meant constant negotiation, constant suspicion, constant balancing. It was a world where your ally could also be your rival, where loyalty was real but conditional, where every agreement had a hidden price. Fadden learned quickly that numbers weren't only in budgets. They were in votes, factions, and the fragile mathematics of parliamentary survival. He rose through the ranks with a reputation for competence. In 1938, he became Minister for Commerce. It was a portfolio tied to trade, markets, and the lifeblood of rural Australia. He dealt with the practical realities of exports and prices, and he did it as the world economy trembled under the approach of war. Then in 1939, he became Treasurer of Australia. The timing could not have been more brutal. Because 1939 wasn't just another year, it was the year the world tipped into fire. When war broke out in September, Australia followed Britain in. Suddenly, the Treasurer's job wasn't about incremental improvements. It was about mobilization. It was about funding a war without destroying the economy at home. It was about asking a nation to sacrifice, then making sure the sacrifice didn't turn into collapse. And here the time limit begins to tighten around him, even if he doesn't fully see it yet. In wartime, governments can fall fast. Mistakes are amplified. Patience evaporates. The public wants certainty, and the parliament becomes a pressure chamber. Fadden, the careful accountant, is now holding the national purse while the world demands unlimited spending and the country fears inflation, shortages, and the return of Depression-era misery. He was not the obvious face of wartime leadership. He didn't have the booming voice of a demagogue or the romantic aura of a battlefield hero. His power was quieter, the ability to make the numbers work, to argue that discipline was itself a form of patriotism. But discipline is never popular when fear is high. People want reassurance, not restraint. They want victory, not lectures about revenue. Then in 1939, Prime Minister Joseph Lyons died suddenly. The shock rippled through Canberra. Leadership changed hands. Robert Menzies became Prime Minister, and the coalition had to hold together under wartime strain. Fadden remained treasurer, now working under a leader whose relationship with colleagues could be tense. The government's survival depended on unity, but unity was exactly what wartime politics eroded. By 1940 and 1941, the pressure was relentless. The war expanded. Threats moved closer to Australia. The government faced criticism from labor, from the press, and from within its own ranks. Every budget decision became a political weapon. Every shortage became a scandal. Every military setback became a question. Who is to blame? Fadden, in the middle of it, kept doing what he knew. Balancing, calculating, trying to keep the machine from tearing itself apart. But the machine was already shaking. The coalition's internal dynamics were shifting. The Country Party itself was changing leadership, and Fadden's own standing within it was rising. He was no longer just a capable minister. He was becoming a central figure, a man others looked to when the government wobbled, and the wobble was turning into a lurch. In 1941, dissatisfaction with Menzies grew. The war demanded a leader who could command confidence, and confidence was draining away. Menzies traveled to Britain, returned to a colder political climate, and faced a party room that was losing faith. The coalition, already fragile, began to crack along its seams. Fadden's life, which began in the heat of a small Queensland town and hardened in the cold logic of ledgers, was now approaching a moment that would define him. He had spent years learning that stability is never guaranteed. Now he was about to discover the most dangerous truth in politics. Sometimes you can do everything right and still run out of time. You can almost hear the stopwatch the moment Arthur Fadden steps closer to the top job. Tick, tick, tick. Because in 1941, Australia doesn't have the luxury of settling in. The Pacific is turning into a killing field. Britain is bleeding. And in Canberra, the government is held together by the thinnest strip of parliamentary arithmetic, like a bridge made of wet paper. One wrong step, and the whole thing drops into the river. Robert Menzies is Prime Minister, but the war is eating his authority alive. He has enemies across the chamber and skeptics behind his own back. The coalition, United Australia Party and Country Party, needs unity like oxygen, yet it's breathing distrust. Fadden, as treasurer, is right in the blast zone. Every decision he makes has a price tag and a political casualty list. Wartime finance is not a neat ledger. It's a furnace. The nation needs ships, planes, munitions, training camps, fuel, food reserves, everything at once. And the public memory of the Great Depression is still raw. People fear that war spending is just another road back to unemployment and hunger. So Fadden is forced to do the impossible trick. Spend like a nation at war, but reassure like a nation at peace. He pushes war loans, tighter controls, measures to direct resources because if money chases scarce goods, prices explode. Inflation becomes its own enemy army, marching through households and pay packets. But the real danger isn't only economic. It's political physics. The government's majority is so narrow that two independents, Arthur Coles and Alexander Wilson, can decide who governs. Two men, two votes, and suddenly the fate of a continent can hinge on a conversation in a corridor. That's the kind of pressure that makes even seasoned politicians sleep with one eye open. Inside the coalition, the Country Party is changing too. Archie Cameron's leadership is fraying. The party wants steadier hands, someone who can negotiate without detonating the room. Fadden, with his calm manner and reputation for competence, becomes the obvious alternative. In March 1941, he is elected leader of the Country Party. It's a promotion that looks like security, until you realize it also makes him the man who will be blamed if the coalition collapses. Menzies tries to hold on. He travels to Britain, seeking to strengthen Australia's voice in the Imperial War Councils, but the trip becomes a political wound. Back home, colleagues resent his absence. Critics say he's out of touch. The war is moving faster than speeches. When he returns, the atmosphere is colder, the patience thinner. The party room is no longer a team, it's a jury. By August 1941, Menzies is finished. He resigns. And now the coalition has to choose a successor in the middle of a global emergency, with the government already wobbling on those two independent votes. The United Australia Party turns to Arthur Fadden and asks him to lead. An extraordinary moment. The leader of the junior coalition. Partner is asked to become prime minister because the senior partner can't find a figure who can command confidence. Fadden accepts. He has to. Refusing would look like cowardice, and it would likely shatter the coalition anyway. On 29th August 1941, Arthur Fadden becomes Prime Minister of Australia, and the stopwatch gets louder. Because he doesn't inherit a stable government. He inherits a cliff edge. The war is escalating, and the parliament is a knife fight conducted with polite language. Labour, led by John Curtin, is waiting, disciplined, hungry, and increasingly seen by the public as a credible wartime alternative. The independents are watching every move, weighing promises against performance. And within the coalition itself, loyalties are conditional. Fadden is prime minister, but he is not surrounded by unquestioning followers. He is surrounded by men calculating their own survival. He tries to project steadiness. He keeps his focus on finance and war administration because that's what he knows. Keep the machine running. Keep the money flowing. He keep the economy from buckling under the weight of mobilization. But politics isn't only about competence. It's about numbers in the chamber, and his numbers are a thread. Then comes the moment that turns his prime ministership into a countdown you can almost visualize. A single budget. In wartime, a budget is not just a financial plan. It's a declaration of priorities. It tells soldiers and factory workers and farmers what the government thinks matters most. It tells the public who will carry the burden. It tells the parliament whether the government understands the scale of the crisis. And it gives the opposition a target the size of a barn door. Fadden prepares his budget under conditions that would break most people. Shortages, competing demands from the services, pressure to expand production, fear of inflation, fear of debt, fear of public backlash. He has to ask Australians for more taxes, more savings, more restraint, while promising that the war effort will not collapse into chaos. He delivers it on 23 September 1941, and immediately the chamber becomes a trap. Labour attacks, that's expected, but the real danger is the independents. Coles and Wilson have been propping up the government, but their support is not a marriage. It's a temporary arrangement. They want a stronger, more unified war effort. They want less political gamesmanship. They want confidence that the government can actually govern, and as they watch the coalition's internal strains, as they watch the constant maneuvering, they begin to doubt that Fadden, however capable, can command the stability the moment demands. Behind the scenes, the pressure is brutal. Every conversation is loaded. Every handshake is a test. Every promise is weighed against the fact that the government could fall tomorrow. Fadden is trying to run a country at war, while also running a parliamentary survival campaign hour by hour. Then the blow lands. On the 3rd October 1941, the budget is put to a vote. Coles and Wilson cross the floor. The government is defeated on its own budget. One of the clearest signals a parliament can send that it has withdrawn confidence. In that instant, Fadden's prime ministership effectively ends. Not with a dramatic resignation speech, not with a scandal, not with a personal collapse, just the cold click of parliamentary arithmetic. 40 days. A man can barely unpack his papers in the prime minister's office in 40 days. Yet in that time, Fadden has carried the weight of a nation at war, knowing the whole time that 2 independent votes could erase him. The image is almost cruel. The careful accountant, the man who believes stability can be built with discipline and numbers, brought down by numbers of a different kind, head counts in a chamber. He goes to the Governor-General and resigns. John Curtin is commissioned to form government. The transfer of power is swift because the war does not pause for political mourning. Australia needs a government that can command the House, and now it has one. But here's the twist that makes Fadden's 40 days more than a footnote. He doesn't vanish. He doesn't become a bitter ghost on the backbench. He becomes instead a crucial pillar of the opposition, and a man whose influence will grow precisely because he has already tasted the top job and learned how quickly it can be taken away. The coalition has to rebuild itself after the shock. The United Australia Party is weakening, its credibility damaged by years of instability. The Country Party under Fadden is comparatively cohesive, and Fadden, who has now been treasurer, party leader, and prime minister, has a kind of authority that doesn't come from charisma, but from endurance. He has been inside the furnace. In opposition, he faces a new conflict, not just against Labour, but against the fear that the non-Labour side is finished. Curtin's government will soon be defined by the Pacific War's direct threat to Australia, and the public will rally around wartime leadership. For the coalition, attacking too hard can look unpatriotic. Attacking too softly can look irrelevant. Fadden has to navigate that narrow ridge, keeping his party alive without appearing to sabotage the war effort. He also has to manage the internal reality that the old political order is dying. The United Australia Party is fraying into factions and personal rivalries. The non-Labour forces will need a new shape, a new banner, a new leader who can unify them. Fadden is not blind to this. He watches the shifting ground and understands, with the instincts of a man who has spent his life reading balance sheets, that the numbers are changing and the old structure won't hold. So he digs in. He keeps the country party steady. He works the parliamentary angles. He maintains relationships that matter. And he waits, because in politics, as in finance, timing can be everything. The war continues to dominate everything, but the domestic political struggle is quietly reorganizing itself beneath the surface. Curtin's Labour government will not be permanent. The coalition will return one day. The question is, when it does, who will be holding the keys? Fadden has already learned the most painful lesson a prime minister can learn. You can reach the summit and still have no control over the weather. Now he is determined that next time, if power comes again, it will not be balanced on a thread. And somewhere in the background, the clock that humiliated him in 1941 is still ticking. Only now, he's listening for a different sound. The moment the numbers finally swing back, the humiliation of 40 days doesn't just sting, it brands you. In Canberra, people smile, shake your hand, and quietly file you away as a temporary man. But Arthur Fadden doesn't accept that label. He treats it like a debt on the books. Not something to cry about, something to repay, slowly, relentlessly, with interest. And the war makes everything sharper. Every headline is a casualty list. Every factory shift is a race against a map where the red arrows keep moving south. In this atmosphere, opposition is a dangerous job. Push too hard and you look like you're undermining the nation. Hold back and you become invisible. Fadden's problem is worse. He's leading the country party, tied to a non-labor side that looks exhausted, divided, and, after the fall of Menzies and the collapse of his own government, almost cursed. Yet this is where his real craft shows. Fadden isn't a thunderstorm politician. He's a pressure system politician. He survives by reading the room the way he once read ledgers, where the numbers are, where the liabilities hide, where the next collapse might start. He keeps his party disciplined, keeps lines open, and, most importantly, keeps the coalition idea alive while the old structure rots. Because the United Australia Party is dying in public, it's not one dramatic explosion, it's a slow structural failure. Personal rivalries, ideological confusion, and the sheer weight of wartime decisions have cracked it. The non-labor side needs a new vehicle, a new brand, a new center of gravity. And while others posture, Fadden does something less glamorous and more decisive. He helps hold the bridge together long enough for a replacement to be built. The replacement arrives in 1944-45 as the Liberal Party of Australia forms under Robert Menzies. It's a political rebirth, but rebirth is messy. Old loyalties don't vanish, they mutate. The country party fears being swallowed by a bigger partner. The new Liberals fear being held hostage by rural demands. Fadden's job is to make the partnership workable without letting his party become a passenger. Then history throws another curveball. John Curtin dies in 1945 and Labour, still in government, moves under Ben Chifley. The war ends, but peace doesn't bring calm. It brings shortages, strikes, rationing hangovers, and a public that wants homes, jobs, and certainty immediately. The battlefield shifts from the Pacific to the pay packet, and in that new fight, money becomes the weapon again. Fadden's native language. The 1946 election keeps Labour in power, but the margins and the mood are changing. The coalition is reorganizing, and Fadden is no longer the man who briefly held the top job. He's the steady hand who kept the country party intact through the wilderness and helped negotiate a workable relationship with Menzies, Liberals, in a system built on alliances that makes him indispensable. By 1949, the tension in the country is thick enough to taste. The Chifley government's attempt to nationalize the banks has ignited a firestorm. To many Australians, it looks like a line being crossed. Government reaching into private finance, into savings, into the machinery of everyday life. The coalition seizes the moment. Many's campaigns as the defender of individual security and enterprise. Fadden, with his reputation for fiscal seriousness, becomes the reassuring counterweight. Not just anti-labor, but pro-stability. The election swings, the coalition wins, and suddenly Fadden is back where he is most dangerous, at the center of the nation's finances. He becomes treasurer again, this time not in a fragile wartime minority, but in a government with the numbers to actually govern. Here's the visual. The same man who was toppled by a budget vote in 1941 now walks back into the Treasury portfolio with a mandate. It's like watching someone return to the scene of a near-fatal accident, not to mourn, but to take control of the road. The early 1950s are not gentle years for a treasurer. Australia is transitioning from wartime controls into a booming but volatile economy. Demand surges, prices rise. The Korean War erupts in 1950, and suddenly commodities and wool, Australia's lifeblood, become part of a global scramble. Money floods in, fortunes are made fast, and with that comes the monster every treasurer fears: inflation that eats wages, savings, and political trust. Fadden's conflict now is not a rival across the chamber. It's the economy itself, an overheating engine that can seize without warning. He has to cool it without stalling it. He has to restrain spending without strangling growth. And he has to do it while the public is intoxicated by prosperity and allergic to restraint. So he reaches for the tools he trusts: budgets, taxation settings, credit policy, and the hard, unpopular language of discipline. He supports measures aimed at curbing inflationary pressure, tightening where necessary, trying to keep the post-war boom from turning into a price spiral. This is not the kind of politics that wins cheers. It's the kind that prevents panic later. And it puts him in the crosshairs. Business groups want freedom, workers want wage security, and everyone wants the government to deliver prosperity without the bill. Inside the coalition, the balancing act is constant. The country party's base, farmers and rural communities, want strong returns for primary producers, infrastructure, and protection from city-centric policy. The Liberals have their own constituencies and economic instincts. Fadden becomes, again, the negotiator who can translate between worlds: rural and urban, producer and consumer, restraint and expansion. Then comes one of the most dramatic economic episodes of the era: the wool boom. Prices surge to astonishing levels, so high they feel unreal, like numbers typed by a delirious clerk. People talk about wool kings. The countryside sees sudden wealth, and with it, sudden risk. Because booms don't just lift, they distort. They encourage overborrowing, speculative buying, and the belief that today's price is tomorrow's guarantee. Fadden watches this with the wary eyes of a man who remembers the Depression. He knows what happens when optimism becomes a national religion. The danger isn't only that prices will fall, it's that people will build their lives on the assumption they never will. His job is to keep the national accounts from becoming a fantasy novel. And while the economy surges, the Cold War tightens its grip. Security, loyalty, and ideology become political explosives. The Menzies government pushes to ban the Communist Party, leading to a referendum in 1951. The country is asked to decide how far it will go in the name of security. It's a moment when fear and principle collide in the voting booth. Fadden, as a senior figure in government, is part of a leadership trying to steer through that collision without tearing the democratic fabric. The referendum fails, the no vote wins. It's a shock to the government and a reminder that Australians, even when anxious, don't easily surrender civil liberties to executive power. For Fadden, it's another lesson in limits. You can have authority and still hit a wall of public skepticism. Through these years, his style remains consistent, almost stubbornly so. He doesn't sell dreams, he sells solvency. He doesn't perform outrage, he performs arithmetic. In an era when politics is increasingly mediated by radio soundbites and newspaper battles, he remains a man of measured sentences and careful framing. That restraint becomes its own kind of strength. People may not adore him, but they tend to believe he is serious. And seriousness matters when the government faces the constant threat of economic whiplash. Inflation pressures, shifting global markets, and the demands of a growing population all collide. Australia is expanding. More industry, more suburban development, more cars, more consumer goods. Government decisions now shape not just war survival, but the architecture of everyday life. Fadden's tenure as treasurer stretches year after year, 1949 into the mid-1950s, making him one of the long-serving holders of the office. That longevity is not accidental. It's earned through a kind of political endurance that doesn't look heroic on camera, but is brutal in practice. Endless briefs, cabinet, fights, late-night revisions, and the knowledge that one misjudged budget can detonate confidence. And always in the background is the memory of 1941, the budget that killed his prime ministership. It's not just a memory, it's a private deadline he carries. Every budget is a confrontation with that old ghost. Will this one hold? Will the numbers stand? Will the House, the party room, the public accept the burden? He also has to manage the personal reality of time. Politics is a young man's sport played by older men, and the calendar is merciless. Fadden is not climbing anymore. He is holding the treasury, holding the coalition balance, holding the line against economic overheating. The pressure isn't a single dramatic showdown. It's the grind of being responsible for outcomes that millions will feel in their kitchens and pay envelopes. By 1958, after years at the financial helm, he steps down as treasurer. It's a quiet exit from one of the most punishing jobs in government. No victory parade, no cinematic farewell. But the significance is enormous. The man once dismissed as a 40-day prime minister has spent nearly a decade as the financial backbone of a long-running government. And even then, he doesn't simply disappear. He remains leader of the Country Party until 1958, shaping its identity and its bargaining power within the coalition. He helps ensure it is not merely an accessory to liberal rule, but a partner with leverage, especially in rural policy and the distribution of national attention beyond the cities. The unexpected twist of Fadden's story is that his greatest influence doesn't come from the office with the grandest title. It comes from the office where decisions are least forgiving. Prime ministers can be remembered for speeches. Treasurers are remembered, when they're remembered at all, for whether the country stayed stable while the world shook. Fadden's legacy in these years is not a single law with his name stamped on it. It's the steadiness he helped impose on a post-war nation, trying to sprint into modernity without tripping over its own prosperity. He is the man who understood that a boom can be as dangerous as a bust, and that the public's patience for restraint is always shorter than the time it takes for consequences to arrive. And now, with the Treasury behind him and leadership passing to a new generation, the question hangs in the air like the last note of a tense song. What does a man do after he has spent his life keeping the national machine from flying apart? Especially when he knows better than almost anyone how quickly power can vanish. One day you're holding the nation's purse strings, deciding how hard the brakes should be on an overheating economy. The next you're just a man in a suit walking out of Parliament, and the building doesn't even flinch. No sirens, no curtain call. The most dangerous part isn't losing power. Arthur Fadden learned that in 40 days back in 1941, the most dangerous part is what comes after. When history stops needing you, but you're still alive, still sharp, still carrying the habit of responsibility like a weight you can't put down. Because for Fadden, stepping away isn't a retirement. It's a countdown. He leaves the Treasury in 1958, and with it the daily adrenaline of budgets, markets, and cabinet fights. He also hands over the leadership of the Country Party that same year, ending a long stretch where his voice wasn't just influential, it was structural. For years, he'd been the hinge between rural Australia and the Liberal Party's urban base. The man who could keep a coalition from cracking by sheer force of arithmetic and temperament. Now the hinge is removed, and the door still swings. That's the quiet insult of political time. It proves the machine can run without you. But Fadden doesn't vanish. He stays in the House of Representatives, still the member for McPherson, still turning up, still reading papers the way he once read. Ledgers, looking for the hidden liability, the line item that will come back to haunt everyone. The public sees an older statesman. Inside the building, he's something more specific. Institutional memory with a pulse. A man who remembers the Depression not as a story but as a smell. Empty shops, tight credit, fear in ordinary voices. A man who remembers wartime rationing, the fragility of supply, the way a nation can be forced to improvise its own survival. And a man who remembers, with a private wince, how quickly a government can die on the floor of the House. That memory makes him cautious about triumphalism. The 1950s have been good to Australia in many ways. Growth, suburban expansion, rising consumption. But Fadden's instincts are built. For the moment when the music stops, he watches the country modernize and knows modernization is never free. It's paid for in debt, in policy mistakes, in inflation, in the slow drift of people away from the land and into the cities. The Country Party's reason for existing, rural leverage, has to keep evolving, or it becomes nostalgia with a logo. And here's the twist. The man who once looked like a temporary prime minister becomes, in his later years, a kind of permanent reference point. When arguments flare inside the coalition about spending, about rural support, about how hard to squeeze credit, people still listen. When Fadden speaks, because he speaks like someone who has seen the bill arrive. He doesn't need to shout. He just needs to remind them what happens when you pretend numbers are feelings. Yet even that influence has an expiry date. Politics is a room that slowly fills with people who don't remember your battles. New members arrive who were children during the war, teenagers during the bank nationalization fight, young adults during the wool boom. They know the names Curtin, Chifley, Menzies, but they don't feel the heat of those years. To them, Fadden is a figure from the previous reel of film, and then the clock tightens. In 1961, after decades in federal politics, Fadden leaves Parliament. Not in scandal, not in defeat. He simply steps away, ending a career that began when Australia itself was still learning what it meant to be a modern nation. The man who once carried the Treasury through inflation, scares and boom distortions, now has to carry something else. The silence after relevance. He returns to Queensland life. But return is a strange word for someone who has lived so long inside the national argument. The habits don't switch off. He remains engaged, consulted, respected. An elder of the conservative side, a former prime minister, a long-serving treasurer. But the center of gravity has moved. Canberra keeps producing new crises, new slogans, new faces. The headlines no longer require his signature. And this is where the real conflict of his final act sits. Not against an opponent in Parliament, not against labor across the chamber, not even against inflation or a boom. It's against time itself. And time is the one rival you can't negotiate with, can't outlast by discipline, can't defeat by clever accounting. It just keeps taking things away. Your office, your daily purpose, your contemporaries, your physical stamina. It turns even the most consequential life into a set of memories other people summarize in a paragraph. Fadden tries to shape what remains. Reputation, legacy, the story that will be told when he's no longer there to correct it. And he knows how brutal that story can be. 40 days as Prime Minister is the kind of fact that sticks like a label on a file folder. It's easy, lazy, and irresistible. Australia's shortest-serving Prime Minister. A trivia answer, a punchline, a footnote. But Fadden's life refuses to fit inside that box. Because if you follow the thread honestly, the 40 days are not the point. They're the wound. The point is what he did after. He became treasurer again and held the job for years, steering through post-war transition, commodity shocks, and inflation pressure. He helped stabilize a coalition arrangement that would dominate Australian politics for long stretches. He represented a rural constituency while operating at the highest level of national finance. An unusual combination that made him both suspect to some and invaluable to others. He was never the charismatic hero of the story. He was the man who kept the story from collapsing under its own weight. And still, the label persists. That's the cruelty of public memory. It loves the dramatic moment more than the long, grinding work that actually shapes outcomes. In his later years, Fadden becomes a living contradiction to his own myth. People meet him and expect a faded relic, a man defined by a brief failure. Instead, they find someone who endured, someone who took the most public humiliation a leader can take and turned it into a long career of influence. The humiliation didn't break him, it trained him. It made him allergic to fantasy. It made him careful with promises. It made him understand that politics is not a stage. It's a balance sheet, and eventually every lie is an unpaid debt. The final images of his life are quieter than the earlier ones, but they carry their own weight. An older man no longer in the chamber, watching the country he helped shape move into a new era. Television politics, new social currents. A changing economy, a different kind of Australia. The world that formed him, small-town bookkeeping, depression scars, wartime austerity, recedes further into the past. And yet those experiences remain embedded in the institutions he served, in the habits of fiscal caution, in the coalition mechanics. So in the idea that stability is not glamorous, but it is precious. On 21st April 1973, Arthur Fadden dies at the age of 79. By then, Australia is already in a different political moment, with new debates and new leaders. The temptation is to file him away as an artifact of the Menzies era, a supporting character in someone else's epic. But that misses the sharper truth. Fadden's story is not the story of a man who briefly became prime minister. It's the story of a man who learned earlier than most how quickly power can evaporate, and who built his entire life around never being unprepared for that evaporation again. A man who treated politics like finance. You don't get to keep what you can't sustain. A man who understood that the nation's confidence is a fragile currency, and once it's devalued, it's painfully hard to restore. So when you hear 40 days, don't picture a joke. Picture a warning. Picture a government collapsing like a chair with one leg kicked out. Picture a man standing up from the wreckage, straightening his jacket, and deciding quietly, stubbornly, that he will not be remembered only for the fall. And in the end, he isn't. He's remembered for endurance, for the long, unglamorous labor of keeping a coalition together, of keeping budgets credible, of resisting the intoxication of booms, of carrying the memory of hard times into rooms full of people who wanted to believe hard times were gone forever. His legacy isn't a single dramatic victory. It's the steadiness that prevented disasters you never get to see. Because when a treasurer does his job well, the catastrophe is the thing that doesn't happen. That's the paradox Arthur Fadden leaves behind. The man most famous for a short tenure spent the rest of his life proving that the real measure of power isn't how high you rise. It's how long you can hold the line after you've been knocked down, and how much of the country is still standing when you finally let go.